Hey everyone, let's dive into one of the most chilling and infamous chapters in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. Picture this. It's the late 1600s in a small Puritan town in Massachusetts. Life is tough, and people's beliefs are deeply rooted in religion and superstition. Then, in 1692, something happened that turned this quiet community into a hotspot of paranoia and tragedy. It all started with two young girls, Betty Paris, who was just 9 years old, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 11. They began acting strangely, claiming they were being tormented by witches. Soon, their accusations were backed by two other girls, Ann Putnam and Elizabeth Hubbard, and their strange behavior sparked fear across Salem. They accused women in the village of casting spells and using witchcraft, and before long, the whole town was caught in a frenzy of suspicion. Now, imagine this. A town already divided by old grudges and fueled by Reverend Samuel Paris, a minister who believed witches were an actual threat to the community. He used a Bible verse from Exodus, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," to rally the townspeople. Instead of calming fears, Paris stoked them, channeling all the underlying tensions into something explosive. People who were once neighbors started turning on each other, accusing one another of being in league with the devil. It wasn't just the outcasts who were targeted, even well-respected members of the community found themselves in the crosshairs. The trials were brutal. Over 200 people were accused, and 20 were executed, most of them by hanging. And here's the thing, these weren't criminals. They were mothers, fathers, neighbors, ordinary people caught up in the hysteria. Some even died in jail before they could stand trial. The accusations were often absurd, based on nothing more than rumors or misunderstandings. For example, if someone refused to share something as simple as candles, and the borrower later fell ill, that could be enough to label them a witch. Wild, right? But this wasn't just happening in Salem. Belief in witchcraft had been around for centuries, both in Europe and in the colonies. In England, there had been famous witch trials like the Pendle witches case in 1612, where 10 people were hanged. Back then, the courts didn't need much evidence. An accusation was often enough to seal someone's fate. In Salem, the hysteria peaked when 3 women were accused by the girls, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, a house servant for the Paris family. Tituba confessed, possibly under pressure, and her words only fueled the frenzy. People were terrified, and in a community already on edge due to conflicts over religion, property, and even an ongoing war with Native Americans, this fear exploded into chaos. The Salem witch trials have become a symbol of what happens when fear and suspicion take over logic and justice. They were a dark reminder of how fragile human judgment can be when we're overwhelmed by paranoia and division. And the Salem witch trials weren't just a case of superstitions running wild. They were a storm fueled by fear, tension, and belief. Sarah Good, for instance, was already an outcast, a homeless woman begging for scraps. She'd even stayed briefly with Samuel Paris, but he quickly kicked her out, accusing her of being ungrateful and malicious. Sarah Osborne, meanwhile, had wealth but not much respect. She hadn't attended church in years, claiming illness, which didn't sit well with her Puritan neighbors. And then there was Tituba, likely of Arawak origin, who had been enslaved and brought to Massachusetts after working on Paris's plantation in Barbados. She became a central figure in the trials, accused of witchcraft after allegedly telling the Paris children stories of spirits and magic. Under pressure, and reportedly after being beaten by Paris, Tituba confessed to witchcraft and claimed Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were her accomplices. This confession introduced wild imagery of broomsticks, demonic figures, and animal-like familiars. It fit perfectly with the villagers' fears and the children's accusations. But it didn't save anyone. Osborne was hanged in May 1692, and Good followed in July, each insisting they were innocent. As for Tituba, her confession spared her from execution, but she languished in jail until someone eventually purchased her freedom. After that, her story fades from the records. These first accusations in February were only the beginning. By March, the frenzy escalated, sweeping up people who seemed untouchable, like Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, both respected devout church members. Corey had dared to question the legitimacy of the accusations, suggesting the girls were lying. That was enough to paint her as a witch. Nurse, meanwhile, became a target of the Putnam family, who claimed her specter was tormenting them. In court, the accusers claimed they saw visions of Nurse's ghost and even an invisible yellow bird feeding from her hand. Absurd as it sounds, such spectral evidence was taken seriously, largely because of Cotton Mather, a prominent theologian who had written extensively on the supernatural. Even when Mather himself started cautioning against relying too heavily on spectral evidence, the trials pressed on. People accused others left and right, often to settle old grudges or gain land. Martha Corey's husband, Giles, was accused when he defended her. He refused to plead guilty or not guilty, knowing a trial would mean losing his property. As punishment, he was pressed to death, crushed under heavy stones, yet he never confessed, ensuring his estate went to his heirs instead of his accusers. The mounting absurdity of the accusations, along with recanted confessions and doubts about spectral evidence, finally began to slow the frenzy. By May 1693, the trials were halted, and remaining prisoners were pardoned. But the damage was done. 19 people had been hanged, Giles Corey had been crushed to death, and others had died in jail. Over 200 lives were forever marked by the stain of accusations, even if they were eventually cleared. In the aftermath, Massachusetts tried to make amends. A day of fasting and repentance was declared in 1697. Judges and other participants publicly asked for forgiveness, and some convictions were overturned. By 1711, 22 people had been exonerated, and financial reparations were approved, though it took until 2001 to clear all the names. The Salem Witch Trials remain a dark chapter in history, clouded by myths and misconceptions. For example, many people believed the accused witches were burned at the stake, but that wasn't the case. They were hanged. And though the trials have often been seen as targeting poor, marginalized women, accusations spanned all classes and even included men, and bizarrely, 2 dogs. The reasons for these accusations ranged from the trivial to the absurd. George Burroughs, a former minister, was accused because of his impressive physical strength, while another woman faced charges simply because her clothes never seemed to get dirty, even on Salem's dusty roads. As for why the hysteria happened, explanations abound. Some blame ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus in the rye crop, but that theory doesn't account for the trial's scope or duration. Others point to class tensions between Salem Village and Salem Town, but again, this doesn't fully explain the frenzy. The most plausible explanation lies in the deeply ingrained religious beliefs of the time, coupled with social pressures and the colonists' existing fears of the supernatural. Once the accusations started, they took on a life of their own, confirming what many already believed about witches and Satan's influence. It's a stark reminder of how fear and ideology, unchecked, can lead to tragedy. Arthur Miller's The Crucible famously drew parallels between the Salem Witch Trials and McCarthyism in the 1950s, showing how dangerous it is when fear and suspicion override reason. In both cases, the accused became scapegoats, sacrificed to the collective anxiety of their communities.